Querido director de Casa África, muchísimas gracias por la información que nos has facilitado y por acogernos en esta casa. Querida presidenta del Parlamento, querida expresidenta Catherine Samba Panza, autoridades, amigas parlamentarias africanas y canarias, señoras y señores. Es un honor y un auténtico placer presentarles, aunque es una presentación que ella no necesita, porque todos ustedes conocen muy bien a Barbara Hendricks. Una persona con una increíble trayectoria como artista y como luchadora incansable por los derechos humanos y por la democracia, pero sobre todo una gran mujer comprometida con la igualdad en todas sus manifestaciones, con un profundo sentido ético de la justicia y una arraigada y solidaria generosidad que le otorga ese don especial, tan escaso pero tan necesario y preciado socialmente, de hacerse cargo de, hacerse cargo de la situación, el momento, el problema y, lo que es más importante, hacerse cargo del otro. Nos ha acompañado desde el inicio de este encuentro, diverso en culturas, razas e ideas, y en el que se ha puesto de manifiesto que es mucho más lo que nos une que lo que nos separa. De hecho, creo que puedo decir que las mujeres que participamos en este foro no hemos encontrado nada que nos separe, pues como el resto de las mujeres del mundo, sabemos no en vano que ser diferente, pensar o sentir distinto no nos hace desiguales. Es más, sabemos que la diferencia llama a la igualdad. Sabemos que la diferencia jamás justifica la discriminación. Todos los seres humanos somos distintos, diversos, plurales, hasta opuestos, pero iguales en consideración, reconocimiento, respeto, trato, dignidad, derechos. Somos iguales en la diferencia. Y de eso, de la utilización de la diferencia como instrumento de discriminación, sabemos más que nadie las mujeres. Sí, mujeres que, como Bárbara, desde tiempo casi inmemorial, venimos denunciando el predominio de un sistema patriarcal que ha utilizado lo que nos distingue a hombres y a mujeres, lo que constituye nuestras diferencias esenciales, genéticas, físicas, biológicas, incluso emocionales, para instaurar un modelo de dominación que, haciendo de lo masculino valor preponderante y de lo femenino valor subordinado, lleva siglos utilizando esas diferencias como arma de discriminación y provocando la desigualdad más onerosa y antigua del mundo, la que más dolor ha producido y más víctimas ha propiciado, la que solo se justifica en el sexo. Y así, nuestra invitada, como mujer comprometida con las causas más nobles y con la música también diversa que desde el jazz o el gospel hasta la ópera tan maravillosamente interpreta, nos transmite siempre pasión, emoción, y nos contagia sentimientos sobre la vida que nos devuelven la esperanza, pues como ella dice, la lucha por los derechos humanos y por el arte son un mismo combate. Un combate que requiere hoy más que nunca de esperanza, pues como decía Aristóteles, la esperanza es el sueño del hombre despierto. Del hombre despierto, vivo, que piensa, siente, planifica, actúa, que se esfuerza, del hombre que desea, porque solo hay una fuerza motriz, el deseo. Continúa diciendo el filósofo, querer. Sin sueños ni aspiraciones, el ser humano se aquieta, se para, se rinde. Y así es, pues como Jorge Guillén escribió en uno de sus versos más célebres, cuando un hombre pierde la esperanza, se vuelve reaccionario. Perder la esperanza es empezar a rendirse, renunciar a avanzar. Barbara Hendricks no se ha rendido nunca. nunca ha renunciado a defender la urgencia de respetar, escuchar, admitir a los seres humanos perseguidos, desplazados, obligados por la violencia o la pobreza a abandonar sus hogares, sus familias. Nunca ha renunciado a estrechar los vínculos con los otros, distintos, diferentes, a promover el entendimiento, a enriquecerse con el discrepante. Bárbara nunca ha tenido miedo. Y las mujeres parlamentarias que hemos reunido estos días aquí también saben mucho del combate, de la lucha por los derechos humanos. Mujeres que ni renuncian ni se aquietan, mujeres distintas, mujeres sin miedo. No todas pensamos igual, obviamente, pero sí compartimos un objetivo común: conseguir el respeto, la dignidad, la libertad y la oportunidad para todas las mujeres del mundo. Yo tengo que decirles que esto es algo en lo que confiaba, ya sabía que iba a ser así, pero por eso no dudé tampoco en invitar a Bárbara, y mucho menos dudé de que acudiría a esta cita, porque la diversidad y el respeto a la diferencia son valores que siempre han sido centrales para ella. Valores que le han valido numerosos e importantes reconocimientos internacionales, desde el Premio Príncipe de Asturias de las Artes a la Legión de Honor francesa, entre otros. Valores tan fuertes como para venir directamente desde La Habana, donde ha ofrecido hace unos días un concierto con una orquesta formada solo por mujeres. ¿Quién hubiera podido estar allí para escucharla justo en estos momentos? Ha venido desde allí para pasar 3 días con nosotras. Gracias, querida Bárbara, querida amiga, por estar aquí. Supongo que recuerdas cómo nos conocimos. Fue hace casi 10 años, en un encuentro parecido a este que celebramos en Madrid, siendo yo vicepresidenta del Gobierno. Éramos aquella vez muchas mujeres, porque veníamos, además de España, de la práctica totalidad de los países del continente africano. Tampoco éramos solo parlamentarias, sino de todos los ámbitos de la sociedad. Pero estábamos también dispuestas, como hoy, a trazar caminos comunes. Y fue en aquel encuentro cuando tuve la oportunidad de conocer, de encontrarme con esta mujer maravillosa cuya talla humana, como enseguida descubrí, supera sus magníficos agudos y sus conocimientos científicos. Porque pocos lo saben, Bárbara es además de todo una matemática. Quizá tenga algo que ver que naciera el mismo año en que se aprobó la Declaración Universal de Derechos Humanos. Pero lo cierto es que Bárbara ha dedicado mucho de su tiempo y muchas de sus fuerzas a defender esos derechos. Algo que ha realizado a lo largo de más de 20 años como embajadora de buena voluntad de ACNUR, pocos menos al frente de su propia organización, la Fundación para la Paz y la Reconciliación, y siempre desde su corazón generoso y comprometido. Y como en la Fundación Mujeres por África nos gusta contar con las mejores, es también componente de nuestro Consejo Asesor. Para nosotros es un privilegio y espero que no le demos demasiada lata en contar con ella, porque la verdad es que Bárbara nunca falla. Hoy nos va a hablar de un tema que, como antes indicaba, ella conoce muy bien, el de los refugiados, y más concretamente el de las refugiadas. Es una auténtica tragedia que desgraciadamente está demasiado presente en nuestras vidas y a la que estamos obligados a encontrar de una vez por todas una solución. No me cabe duda de que escuchar a Bárbara puede inspirarnos, nos va a inspirar seguro en esta tarea que nos concierne, que nos compromete a todos. Querida amiga, muchas gracias por tu integridad, por tu honestidad, por tu humildad y por tu enorme generosidad. Adelante, te escuchamos.
Bonjour. Normalement, pendant ces conférences, les marches des anglophones. Et pour cette raison, j'ai préparé mon discours aujourd'hui en anglais, mais je voulais juste saluer toutes mes sœurs francophones en français. C'est un grand honneur pour moi d'être ici aujourd'hui. Et pour moi, c'est après ces jours passés avec vous, avec nos amis, je crois qu'on s'en passe un peu de protocole et je vais dire, chère Maria Teresa, chère Catherine, chère Carolina et cher monsieur Luis Lopez, le directeur de la maison de la Casa de l'Africa, c'est un grand honneur pour moi d'être ici. Je suis ici pour parler un peu de la situation des femmes réfugiées et maintenant je vais retourner au texte que j'ai préparé en anglais. So maintenant, les interprètes pour changer de casque. On the 14th of December 1950, the Office of the United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees was established by the UN General Assembly. It received a 3-year mandate to lead and coordinate international action to protect refugees in the aftermath of the Second World War. Its primary purpose is to safeguard the rights and well-being of refugees worldwide. Today, there are over 60 million people in the world who have been forced to flee, uprooted from their homes, seeking safety in another country, or internally displaced within their own. Between 75 and 80% are women and children. More than 40,000 people are forced to flee their homes every day. Discrimination and exclusion because of cultural, racial, religious differences, political views, and gender are the root causes of conflict, persecution, and ultimately forced displacement. The UNHCR cares for nearly 46 million refugees, internally displaced and stateless persons, half of whom are women and girls. The majority of people flee because of war, and the proportion of war victims who are civilians increased in recent decades from 5% to 90%. Women and children make up 80% of the casualties by small firearms, and this far outnumbers the military casualties. As of January 2016, 55% of those arriving in Europe are women and children, double the amount of just 1 year ago. Médecins Sans Frontières reports that 1 in 10 women rescued from smugglers are pregnant, often in their second and third trimester. The difficult journey routinely causes miscarriages and premature births, and of course, as you can imagine, there is little or no medical support on the route. 60% of preventable maternal mortality deaths take place in settings of conflict, displacement, and natural disasters. In 27 countries, women still do not have the same rights as men to confer nationality to their children. Many women arriving in Europe without their husbands or fathers come from some of these countries, such as Syria and Iraq. Without proof of paternal descent, their children would not have any nationality and are in danger of becoming stateless. Domestic violence is the most widespread form of abuse against women in the world, with between 1.5 of women being abused by a partner. But most countries do not protect women against domestic violence. Female refugees face multiple risks specific to their gender, including trafficking, early marriage, sexual violence, harassment, and discrimination. Furthermore, they can face a lack of equal access to education, justice, health service, and even food. A UNHCR representative told about his work after the first Gulf War. He was working in a refugee camp for Kurdish refugees, and he had decided to appoint men, without thinking about it, to distribute food in the camp. And then they began to have cases of malnutrition. And then he realized that the problem was that women who were alone with children were not receiving any food at all. He quickly rectified this, and the cases of malnutrition rapidly disappeared. Girls are about 2.5 times more likely to be out of school in conflict-affected countries than girls in conflict-free countries. We all know that the most important key to open the doors of opportunity for girls is education. When a girl is educated, she becomes free. When women are free, the nation becomes free. When women are dynamic and strong, the nation is dynamic and strong. And when women succeed, we all succeed. An estimated 1 in 5 refugees and displaced women in complex humanitarian settings have experienced sexual violence. Likely an underestimation given the barriers associated with disclosure. Our High Commissioner Filippo Grandi told the story of a young woman, Fatima, who fled the war in Syria. She was found on a Greek island in a state of extreme shock. She was severely injured and traumatized. In the hospital, she revealed that she and her daughter had been entrusted by her husband to a man that she did not know, who was to take them out of Syria and get them to Europe. But instead, he took all of her documents, her money, her mobile phone, and sexually assaulted her. She is one of the thousands of women and girls who make the journey on their own, fleeing violence and persecution, only to face a worse situation on their way to Europe. On their way to Europe, where they hope and expect sanctuary, not barbed wire and walls. In Bosnia and Rwanda, rape became a deliberate arm of war. More than 20,000 Muslim women were raped in Bosnia in a single year, 1992. And a great majority of female survivors of Rwanda's 1994 genocide were assaulted. Later, an estimated 45,000 households in Rwanda were headed by children. 90% of them were girls. Conflict and displacement generally cause a rise in the number of female-headed households. In Lebanon today, 20% of Syrian refugee families are headed by women. When I began to work with the UNHCR, I realized that for all intents and purposes, I was born a refugee in my own country. Born without the same rights and protection that the United States Constitution afforded every white girl born on that same day. I was born the 20th of November, 1948, in Stevens, Arkansas, and my life would be governed by Jim Crow laws. 20 days later, the 10th of December in San Francisco, the General Assembly of the United Nations proclaimed and adopted the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. Article number 1, all human beings are born free and equal in dignity and rights. They are endowed with reason and conscience and should behave toward one another in a spirit of brother and sisterhood. My parents never heard about this declaration, but knew all too well the Jim Crow laws that were established in 1876 after the abolition of slavery to legally separate the races in the southern states. These cruel laws, later the model for South Africa's apartheid laws, made it illegal for whites and blacks to use the same schools, hotels, eat in the same restaurants, be treated in the same hospitals, and even drink at water fountains. I still have the memory in my mind of signs that said, white only. As a child, I witnessed the struggle for equality during the civil rights movement that was inspired by a great woman, Rosa Parks, and led by Martin Luther King. After the assassination of John F. Kennedy in 1963, the United States Congress passed civil rights bills in 1964 and 1965. These laws ended institutional segregation, but was of course not the end of racism. However, it was a revolution in my life because I not only received my full rights as a citizen, but also, and more importantly, I received the responsibilities and duties of a citizen, which is what ensures my freedom. I decided then and there to always defend and promote to the best of my ability human rights for all, every day, and in every situation. So when the UNHCR asked me in 1986 to become one of their first Goodwill ambassadors, I saw it as an opportunity to put into action my beliefs that if we are to live in peace and harmony with one another in this home that we call Earth, this can only be achieved if our foundations are firmly anchored in the values of that declaration, and the recognition of the inherent dignity of the equal and inalienable rights of all members of the human family. My first visit to a refugee camp was to Africa. to Zambia, where I met refugees from Namibia who were eager to return home and to prepare their independence from South Africa. I also met refugees from Mozambique who were able to return home, but only some years later, after 14 years in exile. The first time that I encountered issues of violence against women was when I met with young Vietnamese women in 1989 on the Malaysian island of Pulau Bidong, the famous refugee camp of the boat people. These women looked like children, but they were from 16 to 25 years old. They had all been kidnapped by pirates who had attacked their boats, and they were later savagely raped. When they were finally rescued, they were ostracized by their families and lived isolated from the rest of the refugees in the camp. But in spite of their traumatic experiences, they remained hopeful for their future. The situation for women refugees is still very difficult. An assessment mission in Greece and Macedonia, conducted in November 2015, found that measures to protect women and girls were inadequate. Those most at risk were, of course, single women traveling alone or with children, pregnant and lactating mothers, adolescent girls, and early married children. Preventing sexual and gender-based violence is a high priority for the UNHCR. In 2003, we published guidelines on prevention and response to sexual and gender-based violence, which we strive to implement in our operations worldwide. But there is still so much more to do. During these past 30 years working for the refugee cause, I have been inspired by my colleagues working in the field. Most have devoted their lives to protect the rights of refugees, and some, alas, have lost their lives in service to the ideals of solidarity and justice, such as my friend Sergio Vieira de Melo and his 21 brave colleagues, the best that the UN had to offer. They were all killed in the attack on the UN headquarters on the 19th of August 2003 in Baghdad, trying to correct the errors of an illegal, immoral, and poorly executed war in Iraq. In the moments when I feel the most discouraged, I have only to remember their devotion and some of the many remarkable women refugees that I have met since 1987. From Mozambique, Namibia, Mali, Cambodia, Rwanda, Vietnam, Bosnia, and other countries. These women, in the most difficult moments of their lives, continue to struggle with dignity and with enormous courage to care for their children, other members of their family, and sometimes some unaccompanied minors. I will never forget the image of a young Rwandan mother in the feeding center of a camp in Ngara, Tanzania. She sat with her 4-year-old who was in terminal state of malnutrition, refusing any food that was offered to him. There was not a flicker of life left in his eyes, and as he sat passively at his mother's side, his head resting on her shoulder, she was breastfeeding her baby girl. And it was the look in her eyes that captured my attention. Knowing that she would soon lose her son, she still found the courage to stay strong for her baby and to give her the nourishment that would ensure that she would live. Refugee women cannot, will not, and do not give up. So neither can I. And I would just like to end by reading to you excerpts from a poem by a young Somalian woman, a poet living in the UK, and it is called Home. No one leaves home unless home is the mouth of a shark. No one leaves home unless home chases you, fire under feet, hot blood in your belly. It's not something you ever thought of doing until the blade burned threats into your neck. You have to understand, no one puts their children in a boat unless the water is safer than the land. No one chooses refugee camps or strip searches where your body is left aching, or prison, because prison is safer than a city of fire. One prison guard in the night is better than a truckload of men who look like your father. No one can take it. No one's skin would be tough enough. How do the words, the dirty looks, roll off your backs? Maybe because the blow is softer than a limb torn off, or the insults are easier to swallow than rubble, than bone, than your child body in pieces. I want to go home, but home is the mouth of a shark. Home is the barrel of the gun. No one would leave home unless home chased you to the shore, unless home told you to quicken your legs, leave all behind, crawl through the desert, wade through the oceans, drown, be saved, be hungry, beg, forget your pride. Your survival is more important. No one leaves home until home is a sweaty voice in your ear saying, leave, run away from me now. I don't know what I have become, but I do know that anywhere is safer than here. Sometimes I feel like a mother's child. Sometimes I feel like a mother's child. Sometimes I feel like a mother's child, a long ways from home, a long ways from home. Sometimes I feel like freedom is near. Sometimes I feel like freedom is near. Sometimes I feel like freedom is near. But it's a long ways from home, a long ways from home. Merci beaucoup. Thank you very much.